In this lesson, or the series of lessons, we're going to finish the story of the War of Independence. And if you recall, the principle that we talked about last week was that quotation from David McCullough, in which he argues that the Continental Army and George Washington himself, with his character, was the key to the war. It wasn't the Hudson River, it wasn't any of the great population centers or cities, it was people. It was specifically the character of those people. What's incredible about this war and about this whole effort is it really shows us that the Continental Army had to stay alive. They had to keep going. To quote St. Paul, they had to fight the good fight. They had to make certain that they did not give up. In other words, they had to show what we call perseverance. And indeed, it would be a long war and a long conflict. Let me give you an idea of this by reading a quote by Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. He said this: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us. At the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." This is, of course, what you've probably heard before from people older than you, that you often don't understand the value of your freedom or the value that you have to live in the United States. And the reason why we often understand those things is because we haven't really had to pay for them. It's kind of like when your parents pay for something for you, you typically don't value it as highly as if you bought it with your own money, because after all, you didn't have to give anything up to acquire it in the first place. But the patriots of this struggle, and the patriots throughout American history, those who have had to give something up, whether it be money, time, or life itself, they are the ones who best understand what the actual cost of things like freedom or anything worth having actually are. Now, we're going to take a look in this lesson at 4 specific American heroes who are rather diverse. And really, we could make a long list, and we could spend several hours actually talking about the different American heroes, but this is meant to be short. This is meant to give you a taste of these men so you can go on yourself and actually look at them in greater detail. The first of these that you'll need to note was the man by the name of John Paul Jones. And John Paul Jones came from Scotland, which is hardly a surprise. We have a lot of Scotch-Irish characters in American history. He himself believed strongly in the idea of covenant, believed strongly in the idea of having the true authority actually be in power, and if they violated their job as king or ruler, then they should be removed from power. It's interesting, he actually came from Clan Macduff. That was kind of his family's background through his mother's side. And Clan Macduff you might be familiar with if you are familiar with the story of Macbeth, because it was Macduff who actually exposed and then defeated Macbeth, who was this unjust ruler of Scotland who had murdered the king in order to gain the throne for himself. Well, even so, John Paul Jones himself, at the age of 13, joined the English Merchant Marine. And one of the stories told about Jones is that he joined the English Merchant Marine and had experience around the English Royal Navy so that he could learn the tactics of England. After all, he was strongly committed to the cause of Scottish independence, or really the cause of liberty. And so he wanted to find out, how is it that the English are able to fight so well, particularly with their navy? And so by joining them, learning their tactics, he was able to use their tactics against them and even, possibly, find weaknesses. It made him an incredible warrior in battle. When he was still young, he actually became commanding captain at sea when both the captain of the ship he was on and the first mate caught yellow fever. And he did his post with such honor and with such accuracy and diligence that he quickly became a captain of other ships in the English merchant marine. However, eventually he came on the wrong side of the English Navy and actually went through a flogging incident where he was whipped, really for unjust causes, and that led him to come over here to America, where during the War of Independence he became a captain of American ships of war, ships designed to actually go out and defeat that incredibly powerful and incredibly well-equipped British Navy, which itself is a whole lesson in history. Well, as he did this, what made him unique was that he typically took the fight to the enemy. He was not content to stay in coastal waters here along the eastern seaboard of the States of America. He much preferred to actually take the fight over to British waters, to make them understand what the colonies were going through. In fact, it was John Paul Jones, for example, who designed a daring raid in which he proposed that a fleet, I should say, of American ships would go over to Britain, would actually land at one of the coasts along the British Isles, and would actually capture a British nobleman and then use him as a bargaining tool to free several impressed sailors from the American Navy. See, the British had this habit where they would capture an American ship, often a ship that was just a fishing vessel or was just a trade vessel, and they would then take sailors from that ship who came from one of the American states, typically New England states, and they would make those men serve as sailors in the British Navy. It was called impressment. Well, he wanted a way to actually get those men back, and this was his plan. However, he was never allowed to actually execute the plan. Even so, in the year 1779, John Paul Jones, along with other nations who had joined the American cause by this time, launched a huge invasion of British waters. And they actually met the British fleet at a place called Flamborough Head. And it's here where John Paul Jones, in the thick of the fight, seemingly ready to be defeated, said, "I have not begun to fight." He was the kind of man who was stubborn, kind of like Henry Knox, another fellow Scotch-Irish brother, that he was able to not give up easily and able to continue on. It's what made him such a fierce opponent. Another character that I want to take a look at in this lesson was a man by the name of Nathan Hale. And Nathan Hale, we don't have a whole lot of information on him. What we do know is that as a young man, he had a very influential tutor who taught him issues of life, liberty, and property, who taught him the doctrines of the Reformation. And so Hale, who came from Connecticut, became an officer in the American Continental Army and quickly volunteered to be a spy. In fact, he was sent behind British lines in New York to gather intelligence about what the British were planning or doing. It was during this time that he was captured at only the age of 21, and then he was sentenced very quickly to be executed by hanging. Right before his execution, he famously said, "I regret that I only have but one life to lose for my country." It's a short story about Nathan Hale, but yet he made his mark on America. The third character we're going to talk about was Ethan Allen. And Ethan Allen also hailed from Connecticut, and he moved, his father actually moved the family to Vermont early on. Vermont was essentially an extension of New Hampshire, and there were these great opportunities to own large tracts of land and to make a fortune for a relatively low cost, just heavy risk at the time. And so Ethan Allen grew up committed to the state of Vermont, which Vermont was unique because, as I mentioned in past lessons, Vermont fought the war against the British as an independent nation. They were not a part of the Continental Congress. They didn't join what became the United States until they ratified the Constitution several years after the war. It was men like Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys who were able to successfully capture places like Fort Ticonderoga when they stormed it by surprise in the middle of the night, when the British just weren't expecting anything so daring. It was also men like Ethan Allen who invaded Canada and tried to make those northern states of Canada, places like Ontario and Quebec, which were separate nations. There wasn't a Canada really to speak of at that time. He tried to make those nations realize that their cause was united to the cause of the southern 13 colonies, which we now call the United States. But even so, He had this brilliant vision, and he was quite daring in the way that he risked his life for these various causes of liberty. Another thing about Ethan Allen is that he always was committed to Vermont to such a degree that even after the war was over, he continued to fight for Vermont's independence, especially when the Constitution was ratified, because he believed that Vermont should be a sovereign nation. He really was a man who proposed states' rights to a heavy degree. Now, the fourth character and the last man we'll take a look at today was a character by the name of the Marquis de Lafayette, who, by his name, you should be able to tell that he was a Frenchman, and also that he was a nobleman. He was somebody who had a landed estate and had a great fortune to draw from. What's interesting about him is, first of all, his motto. His motto in Latin was cur non, which just means, why not? And that kind of summarizes in some ways the character and the daring nature of the Marquis de Lafayette. He had a rather tragic past, however. His father died when he was only 2 years old. He was then raised by his mother and also by his grandfather, kind of became a father figure to him until the age of 13, when both his mother and his grandfather also passed away. And so when he was 14, the following year, he joined the French army. When he was 16, he married. And then soon after that, when the war over here began against Britain, he saw a certain opportunity, or really he felt compelled to come over here and serve. And so he joined the Continental Army. He actually was commissioned as an officer, and he became one of Washington's most trusted aides. In fact, he became a close friend of other men, such as Alexander Hamilton, another one of Washington's aides. But what's incredible is that through all of his service, and even though he was an independent man from the time he was 13, really, he was a man that Washington had a great affection for. And in later years, Washington would actually formally adopt Lafayette as his son. That shows you the personal relationship between the two. What we see, though, with all of this is that we see that we have very unique heroes in the history of America's past, but they all had a common vision. They all had a common pursuit for what was just, which is what caused them to risk so much in the first place.